Today we'll be looking at Spanish America. Big idea for Spanish America is that Spain established an empire in the Americas. Main ideas: Spanish armies explored and conquered much of the Americas, and Spain used a variety of ways to govern its empire in the Americas. Main idea one: Spanish armies explored and conquered much of the Americas. Conquistadors were Spanish soldiers who led military expeditions in the Americas. Hernán Cortés led a military expedition to Mexico in 1519. Cortés heard of a wealthy land ruled by a king named Moctezuma II. Here we have a modern depiction of the first meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés. Cortés, assisted by this woman right here, who is known as Malintzin, also known as La Malinche. Malintzin was actually a Maya woman. She was from the Yucatan Peninsula, and she was brought along with the Cortés expedition after Cortés made landfall in Yucatan. He found there a shipwrecked Spanish sailor who had been part of a previous expedition years earlier. And he took this Spanish sailor and Malintzin aboard his ship and continued to sail to the coast of Mexico, where they made landfall and then encountered the Aztecs. Malintzin acted as an interpreter for Cortés. She was fluent in the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl. She was not a Spanish speaker, so when Cortés would have her translate, he would first have to speak Spanish to the sailor who had been shipwrecked. The sailor had learned the Maya tongue, and so he would relay what Cortés said in Mayan to Malintzin, and then Malintzin would speak for Cortés. Moctezuma II ruled the Aztec Empire from his capital city of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs had thousands of warriors in various warrior societies like the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors. Cortés had several hundred soldiers and sailors as well as horses and guns. He didn't have a lot going for him. And Cortés knew this from the moment that he first made landfall on the Mexican coast. In fact, to make sure that the men of the expedition would follow his orders, after they had unloaded the ships and all the men had gotten off, Cortés ordered his most loyal men to go back aboard the ships that they had come to Mexico in and burn them. And the reason that he gave for this was that once the men knew that they had no way to get back to Santiago de Cuba, that they would be more willing to follow his orders, because the only way forward, the only way ahead would be obey his orders or basically die. Cortés had a few cannons. They had horses, which the Aztecs had never seen, and of course they had their armor that they wore, steel armor, which metal work like that was something the Native Americans were completely unfamiliar with. Cortés and the Spaniards making landfall in Mexico would be the equivalent today of a flying saucer landing in the middle of our hometown and aliens stepping off of it. It would be pretty shocking, and it was certainly shocking to the Aztecs. In the beginning, Moctezuma welcomed Cortés because of a belief that Cortés may be the return of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. However, Cortés seized Moctezuma, held him prisoner in Tenochtitlan, and later Moctezuma was killed by his own people in fighting between the Spaniards and Aztec warriors. The Spanish ultimately overthrew the Aztec Empire with the aid of thousands of the Aztecs' enemies. The Aztecs were not beloved by their neighbors. They had conquered almost all of the neighboring tribes, and they dominated central Mexico through the use of force. and they made enemies of pretty much everybody around them. And so the Spanish had no problem finding allies to help them overthrow the Aztecs. The Aztecs were also weakened by smallpox and other diseases that were brought by the Spanish. And these diseases, of course, would tear through Native American populations, killing off tens of millions of people all over the Americas. But of course, it had a very serious effect on the Aztecs during their war with the Spanish. And here we have a depiction of Aztec warriors and Spanish soldiers in battle atop the Temple of the Sun in Tenochtitlan. Francisco Pizarro was a member of Cortez's expedition to Mexico, and he would go on to lead a military expedition to the Inca Empire in the Andes Mountains of South America more than a decade after the conquest of the Aztecs. The Inca ruled over territory that stretched from present-day Chile to Colombia, and Pizarro's forces captured and then would later kill the Inca ruler Atahualpa. Pizarro, with the aid of American Indian allies, had conquered the Inca by 1534. Here we have an artist's depiction of the capture of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa by the conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro. Other Spanish explorers. Many Spanish explorers came to North America in the 1500s to find treasure. Much like previous explorers, coming to the Americas was about establishing reputation and finding wealth. Juan Ponce de Leon explored present-day Florida in 1513. This would be the De Leon expedition here. 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon lands near what today is St. Augustine, Florida. Sailed around the southern tip of Florida and made landfall on the east coast in the Gulf of Mexico. Hernando de Soto traveled through Florida and North Carolina in 1539. So here we have the de Soto expedition here, traveling all the way up here. They actually made it into Arkansas and Mississippi. Interesting story about de Soto is that he brought with them their own food supply. De Soto knew that the journey that they were about to take was going to be very long, and so they brought along pigs, a herd of pigs that they would be able to use for meat along the journey, because they brought them because apparently pork is delicious, but also because pigs reproduce fairly rapidly, and so the herd of pigs that they brought with them would replenish itself as they went along. And so they traveled along for a good deal of time, 1539 to 1543. So they were out here for quite a while. But along the way, many of the pigs got away. And the reason why this matters is because here in Arkansas, the pigs themselves went wild. And today, if you're a fan of Arkansas football, you may have heard of the Arkansas Razorbacks, which are named after the wild pigs that were originally pigs that were brought to America by Hernando de Soto. So nice little bit of trivia there. The expedition of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo along the California coast gave Spain claim to the Pacific coast of North America. Cabrillo set off from Navidad here on the west coast of Mexico and sailed up the coast of Baja California and made it way up past Cape Mendocino before the expedition turned back to Mexico. Cabrillo himself was actually killed along the way on Santa Catalina Island on the way back to Mexico. He landed his ships on Catalina to basically replenish their water supply and look for food, and there they encountered Native Americans who were hostile to the landing. Fighting broke out, and Cabrillo himself was killed. The Spanish Empire. Spain's American colonies helped to make it wealthy. Tons of gold and silver were brought to Spain from the Aztec and Inca empires. Food was also grown in Mexico and Peru to support Spain's expanding empire. And here we have a map showing the Spanish Empire at its greatest extent. This would be the Spanish Empire right around 1790, which is close to 300 years after the time that we are looking at. But if you see the areas here in red, red stands for Spain. And these areas here that you see in red in the Americas, this was once the Spanish Empire. So all over North and South America, the Philippine Islands, all of these islands out here in the Pacific Ocean, all of these were at one time claimed by Spain. And then you have conflicting or competing claims between the Spanish and the English and the French over here in what is today British Columbia and part of what are today the states of Washington and Oregon, part of Idaho. The Russians also claimed part of this area right here as well. But this was the Spanish Empire at its fullest extent. It was massive. Focus question number 1. Describe how Spanish conquistadors explored and conquered much of the Americas in the 1500s. Main idea 2. Spain used a variety of ways to govern its empire in the Americas. Ruling New Spain. There was a system of royal officials that were nominated by the Council of Indies. The Council of the Indies was at the top of the governing of the Spanish colonies in the New World. The Viceroyalty of Peru governed South America. The first Viceroy of Peru was Francisco Pizarro, the man who led the conquest of the Inca Empire. And the Viceroyalty of New Spain governed Central America, Mexico, and the southern part of what is now the United States. And the first Viceroy of New Spain was Hernan Cortés, the conqueror of the Aztecs. Life in Spanish America. Pueblos were trading posts and sometimes government centers. Presidios were military bases. Presidios were almost always located near or right at a pueblo or a mission. Priests started missions to convert Indians to Catholicism, converting them to become Catholics, forcing them to learn the Spanish language, would have the effect of making them easier to govern and make them less independent. A missionary by the name of Junipero Serra founded 9 missions in California, starting in 1767. Spain's effect on Native Americans. The encomienda system gave settlers the right to tax local Native Americans and make them work. Most Spanish treated Indians like they were slaves. Indians were forced to grow crops, work in mines, and herd cattle. A Spanish priest by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas defended Native American rights and wrote about them in a book which was actually read by the Queen of Spain and influenced the Spanish royal house to rescind the encomienda, but the system that it was replaced with was really no better. So many Indians died of disease and exhaustion that the Spanish began bringing enslaved Africans to New Spain. And this is the beginning, really, of the transatlantic slave trade outside of the control of the Portuguese. The Portuguese, of course, which we haven't really talked about yet, they had already begun importing Africans from Western Africa to their colony in what is today the country of Brazil. The Spanish claimed that the encomienda would benefit settlers and Indians alike, but it didn't actually work out that way. The plan, as illustrated here, was that Spanish settlers would protect, care for, and Christianize the Indians, convert them to Catholicism. The reality for Native Americans was that they worked a portion of their, they would work a portion of their time for the settlers That was how it was supposed to be. The reality, Spanish settlers forced long labor. They didn't pay their Indian workers, which effectively made them slave laborers. They failed to protect the Indians, and they seized Native American lands. They took their land away from them. As a result of this, Indians died from disease and harsh living and working conditions. So, as if the diseases that the Europeans brought with them weren't bad enough, like smallpox, which killed so many, the living conditions these people were forced to endure killed an awful lot of them as well. The encomienda ended after the protests that were first launched by Bartolome de las Casas, as well as Indian revolts that broke out against the abuses of the encomienda. However, the abuses continued under the replacement system that was known as the repartimiento. Sometimes I trip over my own tongue. Focus question number 2. What were the variety of ways used by Spain to govern its empire in the Americas? The essential question for Spanish America. How did Spain establish its empire in the Americas?